Finch. They wouldn't listen.
2:13 a.m. The smell of stale coffee and antiseptic clung to the air, a familiar perfume for the third watch. In the ICU, silence is never truly silent. It's a fragile truce held together by the rhythmic sigh of ventilators and the steady electronic pulse of heart monitors. It's a sound you learn to trust, until it's broken by something impossible. Chloe, the FNG, the fucking new guy, barely a year out of school and still radiating the earnest terror of the newly graduated, dropped her pen. It clattered against the linoleum with a sound like a gunshot in the profound stillness. We exchanged glances over the tops of our monitors, a high-voltage current of pure, unadulterated disbelief passing between us. I printed the timeline of the nursing notes detailing his decline and his repeated questions. I printed everything. I made copies at the deserted social work office, the whir and click of the machine sounding like an alarm in the silent hallway. I took them home and sealed them in a plain manila envelope. I didn't know what to do with it. Send it to a newspaper? A lawyer? The state medical board? Any of those actions could be traced back to my EMR login. My career, the only thing I had, the thing I had sacrificed so much for, would be over. But I couldn't throw it away. I couldn't erase him again. The envelope sits in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, a heavy rectangular monument to a man who died alone. It's the truth. Waiting. Weeks have passed. Bed 14 has a new patient. Bed 14 has a woman recovering from a car accident. Her room is filled with flowers and balloons that bob gently in the airflow from the vents. Her family visits every day, a loud, loving, chaotic group that fills the room with laughter and the smell of takeout food. Her call light works perfectly, but sometimes, when I'm at the charting station late at night, in that deep, silent part of the watch when the world seems to hold its breath, I'll see a flicker of orange from the corner of my eye. A phantom pulse from the central console. I never look directly at it. I don't need to. I know it's there. That light is no longer a call for a nurse. It's a call for a witness. In the quiet corridors of the hospital, the real ghosts aren't the souls of the dead. They're the memories of the choices we didn't make, the truths we failed to speak, and the countless desperate calls for help that are silenced by the relentless humming machinery of the system. The two junior nurses on the other side of the station, their faces illuminated by the eerie green and blue glow of their screens, looked confused, their brows furrowed in a simple question. Why is everyone freaking out? The veterans, like Maria and me, felt a different kind of chill, one that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive meat locker air conditioning that always seemed to be working overtime on the night shift. It was a cold that started in the pit of the stomach and spiderwebbed its way up the spine, a cold prickle of wrongness that defied every protocol and rational explanation we clung to. Bed 14 was empty. The sheets were stripped, the mattress encased in a crinkling, impermeable sheath of sterile plastic. The machinery, the ventilator, the monitor, the tangle of pumps, was silenced, wiped down with bleach-scented Sani wipes and pushed back against the wall, huddled together like dormant beasts. The IV pole stood naked and gleaming under the humming fluorescent lights, its hooks barren. The patient in bed 14, a quiet, unassuming man named Alistair Finch, had been pronounced dead 3 hours and 7 minutes ago. I knew the exact time, down to the second, because I was the one who had run my stethoscope over his still chest, listening for the profound, absolute absence of a heartbeat, the final silence beneath the silence. I was the one who had held his cool, papery hand as the last faint electrical signal on the monitor, a wavering, agonal rhythm, flattened into a perfect, unwavering line of green light. I was the one who had cleared my throat, the sound rough in the suddenly sacred space, and called it. Time of death, 23:06. I pushed back my chair, the squeak of its cheap plastic wheels obscenely loud in the sudden heavy quiet that had descended. Chloe, her freckled face pale and drawn under the harsh lights, whispered, her voice cracking around the edges. Maybe it's a short? An electrical fault? Her eyes were wide, darting from the blinking console to the dark doorway of bed 14 and back again, She was desperate, grasping for the logical scaffolding we build around ourselves to keep the chaos and the grief and the sheer strangeness of this job at bay. She was looking for reassurance. "Probably," I said, my voice a carefully constructed monotone that betrayed none of the cold dread coiling in my stomach. "Faulty wiring. Logic was our shield, our scalpel, our strongest drug. In this job, you cling to it like a drowning man to a raft. A short circuit, a faulty wire, a pressure-sensitive alarm in the bed. No, the bed was new and unplugged anyway. Maybe the wall panel was loose, a wire jiggled free by the vibrations of the building. There were a dozen rational explanations, and I recited them to myself like a prayer, a mantra against the encroaching darkness. The call light for bed 14 blinked a patient, insistent orange. My head snapped up from the charting station. Every nurse on the floor froze. We exchanged glances, a current of disbelief passing between us. The junior nurses looked confused. The veterans, like me, felt a different kind of chill, one that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. Bed 14 was empty. I walked the short distance down the corridor, my rubber-soled Danskos making a soft, rhythmic squeak on the polished linoleum. Each step felt heavy, deliberate, as if I were wading through water thickened with unseen possibilities. The unit was a horseshoe, the nursing station its central command, giving us a clear panoramic line of sight to every glass-fronted room. Bed 14 was at the far end of the curve, a place that always seemed to collect shadows, the last room to catch the morning light filtering through the grimy windows. As I approached, the rhythmic beeping from the central console seemed to grow louder, more personal. A summons meant only for me. I stopped at the doorway, my hand hovering over the frame, a strange primal reluctance holding me back. The room was cold, sterile, and profoundly, aggressively empty. The only light was the angry orange halo of the call button on the wall, blinking in perfect time with the beeps from the main console, painting the opposite wall in pulsing, hellish shades. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of bleach and something else, something fainter, more persistent. I stepped inside. The air was still, heavy, and colder than the hallway. I could almost smell the ghost of him. Not a spirit, but the lingering scent memory of the man himself. The faint, dusty scent of old books and wool sweaters that had clung to his meager belongings. Mr. Finch had been a retired librarian, a widower for 2 decades, admitted for what they initially thought was a severe galloping bout of pneumonia. He was a man with no family listed on his emergency contacts, just the name of a bookstore owner who, when we called, barely knew him. He came in once a week, the man had said, his voice distant, distracted. Bought history books, paid in cash, kept to himself. He'd been quiet, unassuming, and terribly, crushingly alone. In a unit filled with the constant, high-decibel drama of weeping families and desperate prayers, his solitude had been a quiet tragedy all its own. I remembered bringing him a cup of tea 2 nights ago. He'd held it with trembling hands, his gaze fixed on the steam, and said, "It's funny. You spend your whole life cataloging stories, and in the end there's no one left to read your own." My gloved fingers traced the wall, finding the light switch. The room flooded with the buzzing clinical glare of fluorescent light, chasing the orange shadows into the corners. I ran my hand over the call button panel, a smooth, off-white plastic rectangle set into the wall. I checked for any moisture, any damage, any sign of malfunction that I could document, that I could use to chain this event to the real world. Nothing. It was clean, dry, and solid. I pressed the reset switch, a small, concave button below the main one. The beeping at the nurse's station stopped instantly. The orange light on the wall went out. The room plunged back into its shadowed, humming quiet. The silence it left behind was somehow louder, more accusatory than the alarm had been. I stood there for a long moment, listening. My own breathing sounded ragged in my ears. My heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. Nothing. Just the low thrum of the hospital's aging ventilation system, a sound like a sleeping giant. I felt a powerful, irrational urge to check the closet, to look under the bed, to pull back the shower curtain in the tiny ensuite bathroom. I crushed it with the heel of my professionalism. I was a scientist. I dealt in facts and data, in blood gases and cardiac outputs. The sheets were stripped, the mattress encased in sterile plastic, the machinery silenced and wiped down. The patient in bed 14, a quiet man named Alistair Finch, had been pronounced dead 3 hours and 7 minutes ago. I knew the exact time because I was the one who had held his hand as he slipped away. I was the one who had called it, 2:13 a.m. I turned and walked out, pulling the door almost closed behind me, leaving just a crack of hallway light cutting a sharp, clean line across the empty floor. "Just a glitch," I announced to the unit, my voice louder than necessary, a performance for Chloe and the others. "System's probably due for an update. Wall plate might be loose." I tried to sound bored, unconcerned, as if this were a tedious Tuesday night inconvenience on par with a clogged pneumatic tube. Chloe nodded, the color returning to her cheeks, her relief a palpable wave in the air. She picked up her pen and went back to her charting, the crisis averted, the ghost exorcised by the mundane explanation of faulty wiring. But I saw the way Maria, a woman who had seen everything from miracles to malpractice, watched me over the top of her wire-rimmed glasses. She didn't look relieved. She looked like she knew better, her expression a complex mixture of pity and a deep, weary understanding. She'd seen too much to believe in simple glitches. I went back to my work, trying to bury the incident under a mountain of tasks. The rhythms of the living demanded my attention, and I was grateful for it. Vitals for the septic shock in bed 8. Mrs. Gable, years old, a retired kindergarten teacher, fighting a raging urosepsis that had her on 3 different pressors. I flushed her central line, checked the blood return to ensure it was patent, then meticulously titrated the norepinephrine drip up by 0.02 micrograms, my eyes glued to the arterial line monitor. I watched the jagged red waveform, watching the numbers beside it, waiting for her blood pressure to respond. The mean arterial pressure crept from a perilous 58 to a fragile but acceptable 66, a small victory in a long war. I took a moment to smooth her hair, thin and white against the pillow. Her daughter had called an hour ago, crying, asking if her mom was in pain. "No," I'd lied. "She's resting comfortably." The truth, that she was too sick to register pain, was a cruelty I couldn't bring myself to inflict over the phone. Next, the post-op heart in bed 11. Mr. Chen, fresh from a triple bypass 12 hours ago. His chest tube drainage was still a little too sanguine, a little too much for this far out from surgery. I noted the 100 dfcs output from the last hour in the EMR, my fingers flying across the keyboard. His cardiac rhythm was stable, a clean sinus rhythm marching across the screen, but his potassium was low, a dangerous state for a freshly repaired heart. I scanned his latest labs, pulled a 20 ml potassium bag from the Pyxis machine, and carefully programmed the IV pump to run it over 2 hours, double-checking the rate with a new nurse, a quiet young man named David. "Never run potassium faster than 10 an hour without a direct order and a central line," I told him, the words automatic, a piece of dogma passed down from one generation of nurses to the next. He nodded, his eyes wide. The mundane, life-saving calculus of the ICU was a comfort. It was real. It was measurable. It followed the rules. For an hour, maybe more, the ICU returned to its normal state of controlled crisis. My pulse returned to normal. The cold knot in my gut began to loosen, to dissolve in the acid of routine and exhaustion. It was a glitch, an anecdote, a story to tell over breakfast with the other night shifters about the hospital ghost. Nothing more. Then at 3:28 a.m., it happened again. Beep, beep, beep. The smell of stale, burnt coffee and the sharp, almost metallic tang of cavicide clung to the recycled air, a familiar, acrid perfume for the third watch. It was the scent of exhaustion and futile warfare against microbes. In the intensive care unit, silence is never truly silent. It's a fragile truce, a temporary ceasefire in a war fought bed by bed, hour by hour. The sounds slice through the unit with surgical precision. It was the same pitch, the same rhythm, but this time it felt different. Malicious, intentional. Every sound in the unit ceased, the rustle of charts, the low murmur of David asking a question, the click of my keyboard. All gone. There was only the alarm, a sound that now seemed to be mocking our fragile sense of order. Bed 14. The same insistent orange light pulsing on the board, a malevolent, artificial heartbeat. This time, the silence it created was heavier, more profound, weighted with a shared, unspoken dread. Chloe's pen clattered onto her desk again, a sound of pure, nervous reflex. Every head turned not to the console, but directly to me. Their eyes were wide, questioning, looking to me for an explanation I didn't have. My heart, which had just settled into a comfortable rhythm, kicked into overdrive, hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was no longer a simple glitch. Glitches can be random. This felt deliberate. This felt like a question being asked, a question I didn't want to answer. "I'll handle it," I said, my voice tight, clipped. I stood up, the motion stiff, my joints protesting. I walked back to the room, my professionalism a thin, brittle armor against a rising tide of primal fear. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get the charge nurse, to call security and report a phantom. But I was the one who had been with him at the end. I was the one who had zipped the bag. Somehow, this felt like my responsibility. I didn't want to go in there. The room felt different now, less empty. It felt expectant, as if it were waiting for me. I pushed the door open. The orange light pulsed, casting strange, dancing shadows on the bare walls. The empty bed, the silent machines, the gleaming IV pole, they looked like props on a stage, waiting for an actor who would never arrive. I didn't reset the alarm right away. I just stood there in the doorway, my hand on the cool metal frame, staring at the empty bed where Mr. Finch had spent his last week. He'd been a difficult patient to read. Not complaining, not demanding, just fading. His chart was a puzzle of contradictions. His initial presentation, fever, cough, shortness of breath, screamed pneumonia. But he didn't respond to the heavy-hitting antibiotics we threw at him. His oxygen needs climbed relentlessly, from a simple nasal cannula to a high-flow system pushing 60 liters of humidified air into his nostrils, and still his saturation levels dipped dangerously low. The doctors had been perplexed, muttering about atypical presentations and underlying comorbidities they couldn't pin down. He'd coded at 2306, a clean code, if there is such a thing. No thrashing, no desperate fight for air, just a sudden silent arrhythmia on the monitor. Ventricular fibrillation. We'd worked on him for 20 minutes, the sickening crunch of his ribs under compressions, the high-pitched whine of the defibrillator charging, the metallic taste of adrenaline in my own mouth as I pushed epinephrine and amiodarone into his central line, shocking him 3 times, but it was like his body had already decided to leave. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, had been open, but not seeing us. Not seeing the chaos, the sweat, the desperate effort. They were seeing something else entirely. "Mr. Finch?" I whispered into the empty room. The name felt like a forbidden word on my tongue, a violation of the sterile space. The only answer was the hum of the lights in the hallway and the frantic thumping of my own pulse in my ears. I felt ridiculous and terrified. It's held together by the rhythmic percussive sigh of ventilators forcing air into reluctant, waterlogged lungs, the steady electronic pulse of multi-parameter monitors displaying a fragile calculus of life in green and yellow waves, and the low, incessant hum of the hospital's ancient HVAC system breathing its dusty breath through the ceiling vents. I reached out a trembling hand and slammed my thumb on the reset button, holding it down for a full 3 seconds, as if to punish it for its insubordination. The light died. I practically fled the room, pulling the door shut behind me with a decisive click that echoed in the hallway. Back at the station, I didn't offer any placating explanations. The time for that was over. The faces staring back at me were pale and unsettled. I just picked up the phone, my hand surprisingly steady, and called plant operations. The phone rang 6 times, each ring echoing in the silent unit, a sound of mounting desperation. Finally, a gravelly, sleep-thick voice answered. "This is Sal." Sal, it's Anna in the ICU. I need someone to come look at the call light system in bed 14. It keeps activating on its own. A weary, long-suffering sigh crackled through the receiver. It was a sound I knew well, the sigh of a man who had been fixing this crumbling hospital for 30 years. Room's empty, right? It's always the empty ones. Old wiring, Anna. I see it all the time. Building settles, pressure changes in the walls, static electricity from you guys polishing the floors. Had a light in PEDS once that went off every time the elevator went by. I can come up in an hour, but I'm telling you now, I'm not going to find anything. Just check it, Sal. Please. My voice was sharper than I intended, edged with a desperation that had no place in a professional request. All right. Don't get your scrubs in a twist. He hung up. An hour was a lifetime. I couldn't just sit here and wait for it to happen a third time. I needed another layer of logic, another piece of the rational world to put between me and what was happening in that room. Security cameras. The hallway outside bed 14, with a clear view of the door, was covered by camera 7B. If someone was messing with us, if a sleep-deprived resident was playing a sick, cruel prank, I'd see it. Getting access to the live feed was easy enough. There was a monitor behind the charge desk for that very purpose. But I wanted the recording from the last few hours. That required a trip down to the hospital's basement, where the security office was tucked away behind a steel door with a keypad lock. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into another world. The sterile, brightly lit environment of the ICU gave way to the grimy, utilitarian bowels of the hospital. The air in the basement was thick with the smell of dust, old paper, and industrial cleaning agents. Pipes snaked across the low ceiling, dripping condensation onto the concrete floor with a steady, maddening rhythm. The guard on duty, a young guy named Mike, whose main job was to stay awake and watch a bank of 16 monitors, looked surprised to see me. He was slouched in his chair, a half-eaten bag of chips open on his desk next to a dog-eared fantasy novel. "Everything okay, Anna?" he asked, sitting up straighter and hastily brushing crumbs from his uniform. "Fine. Just had an issue with some equipment near bed 14. Thought maybe a patient from another floor was wandering where they shouldn't be. Can you pull up the footage from camera 7B for the last 4 hours?" He grunted, his fingers tapping at a keyboard sticky with soda residue. The dozen monitors in front of him showed black and white fisheye views of empty corridors, sleeping reception areas, and the deserted ambulance bay. B. Let's see. From around 2300? Yeah, that's good. He clicked and scrolled through a timeline at the bottom of the screen. On one monitor, the hallway outside bed 14 appeared. I watched a grainy, silent movie of our own shift. It's a symphony of survival, a soundscape you learn to read like sheet music, a sound you learn to trust implicitly. You learn the unique cadence of each patient's ventilator, the specific alarm tones of their IV pumps. You learn to filter, to triage the auditory data stream into normal and needs attention new. Until it's broken by something impossible. I saw myself and the crash team rushing into the room. I saw the controlled, frantic ballet of the code. I saw the morgue attendants arrive with a gurney, their movements efficient and somber. I saw myself go in and out to clean the room, carrying armfuls of soiled linen. The timeline was all there, a perfect, objective record. Okay, so the first false alarm was around 2:13 a.m., I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mike navigated to the timestamp. The screen flickered, and then there was only static. A thick, rolling band of gray and black noise, like an old television with no signal. A loud, aggressive hiss emanated from the monitor's small speaker. Huh, he grunted, leaning forward, his novel forgotten. That's weird. What is it? I asked, my throat suddenly dry as desert sand. Signal interference, maybe? Or a data write error? Look, he scrubbed the timeline slider back and forth with his mouse. The footage was perfect, crystal clear, right up until 2:12 Haltung. From 2:12:01 to 2:15:03, it was gone. Just static. Then, at 2:15:04, the clear picture of the empty, silent hallway returned. It was a perfect 3-minute hole in reality. Check the second one, I said, the words feeling thick in my mouth. 3:28 a.m. He typed, the same result. A perfect feed until 3:2700, a 3-minute block of pure, unadulterated static, and then a clear feed again at 3:30:02. "I've never seen that before," Mike said, leaning even closer to the screen, genuinely intrigued now. "It's like the data for those specific moments was just erased or never recorded. I'll have to flag it for the IT guys in the morning. They'll probably say a transformer blew somewhere or the server needed to reboot." I stared at the rolling static, and the rational explanations felt like they were dissolving into thin air. A faulty wire and a call button was one thing. A data-corrupting energy field that only appeared for 3-minute intervals at the exact moment the call light was pressed. The odds were astronomical. I left the security office with a cold certainty growing in my chest. This wasn't about a ghost. Ghosts were simple, campfire stories. This was something else. Something human and broken. When I got back to the ICU, Sal was there, his heavy toolbox open on the floor outside bed 14. He was a squat, powerful man in a grease-stained gray jumpsuit, his face a roadmap of weary cynicism. He was unscrewing the wall plate for the call button, his movements practiced and efficient. "Told you," he said without looking up, his voice a low grumble. "Wiring's fine. A little old maybe, but the connection's solid. No shorts. No frays." He pulled the mechanism out from the wall, a small bundle of colored wires. He took out a multimeter and tested the contacts, the device emitting a steady, healthy beep. I tested the button mechanism itself. Perfect condition. Clicks just fine. Solid spring. He screwed the plate back on with a final definitive twist. "It's just one of those things. This place has a memory." He packed up his tools, the metallic clatter echoing down the hall, and shuffled away, leaving me alone, staring at the benign-looking plastic switch on the wall. My shift was supposed to end at 7 a.m. I had 3 hours left. 3 hours to either ignore the impossible or try to understand it. Ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. My professional curiosity had curdled into a kind of fearful, obsessive determination. I needed Mr. Finch's chart. The physical chart was a thick, messy beast, full of loose lab reports and handwritten, barely legible notes from consulting physicians. But the real story, the digital ghost, was in the EMR, the electronic medical record. The call light for bed 14 blinked a patient, insistent orange on the central nursing console. A single, sharp note of discord in our carefully orchestrated quiet. A staccato demand in a room that had no right to be demanding anything. My head snapped up from the charting station, the words of my progress note for the septic shock in bed 8 dissolving on the screen. I sat down at my station, the familiar glow of the monitor, a small comfort in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. I logged into the system, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I pulled up Alistair Finch, DOB 04/12/1953. No known allergies. Admitted 6 days ago. Chief complaint, shortness of breath, fever, productive cough. I scrolled through the initial workup. The emergency department notes. The admission history and physical. Chest X-ray showed diffuse bilateral infiltrates, a classic whiteout pattern, classic severe pneumonia. They started him on broad-spectrum antibiotics, vancomycin and Zosyn, the big guns. But he didn't respond. His oxygen requirements kept climbing. His inflammatory markers, CRP, ferritin, D-dimer, were through the roof. I read the clipped, worried notes from the attending physician, Dr. Evans. Patient failing standard therapy, atypical presentation, consider alternative etiologies. I kept digging, clicking deeper into the labyrinth of tabs and hyperlinks. Progress notes, lab results, which I tracked on a graph, watching his white count climb and his kidney function plummet in a terrifying inverse relationship. Imaging reports. And then I found it. Buried deep in the consultation requests tab, a place nurses rarely look unless they're tracking down a specific order. A note from a pulmonologist, Dr. Desai, dated 3 days ago. It was brief, almost cryptic in its urgency. Findings suggestive of rapidly progressing interstitial lung disease, possibly acute fibrinous and organizing pneumonia, AFOP, a rare but aggressive non-infectious process. This presentation is highly concerning. Recommend immediate high-dose corticosteroid therapy, Solumedrol 1 gram IV daily, and consultation with rheumatology to rule out autoimmune causes. Also recommend urgent thoracic surgical consult for video-assisted lung biopsy to confirm diagnosis. This is a time-sensitive diagnosis. Delay in treatment is associated with extremely poor outcomes. A time-sensitive diagnosis. My eyes scanned the record, my heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat against my sternum. The high-dose steroids were ordered and administered. Good. But the surgical consult for the biopsy, the definitive diagnostic tool that could have confirmed Desai's theory and changed the entire course of treatment? I clicked on the order. A small window popped up. Status: pending insurance authorization. My blood ran cold. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. Pending insurance authorization. It's a phrase we see every day, a benign-sounding piece of bureaucratic jargon that can be, and often is, a death sentence. It means the hospital's business office is fighting with the patient's insurance company over who will pay for a procedure. It means a human life, a breathing, suffering man, is sitting in a queue waiting for a clerk in a cubicle farm 1,000 miles away to click approved. I looked at the date on the consult request. 3 days ago. For 3 days, while we dutifully administered antibiotics that were doing nothing, Alistair Finch had sat in that bed, his lungs progressively turning to scarred, useless tissue, while the system debated the cost-effectiveness of saving him. I scrolled feverishly through the nursing notes for those days. My own notes were there, clinical and detached, a damning record of my own ignorance. They painted a grim, damning picture. Patient reports increased dyspnea. O2 sats dropping to 85% on 15L high flow, notified Dr. Evans. Patient appears anxious, asking why he isn't getting better. Patient asking to speak to doctor again about treatment plan. He was asking for help, over and over. Maps holding in low 60s, despite Levophed titration to 0.12 kg min. Urine output remains scant. 20 /HR Dr. Evans notified, awaiting new orders. The clinical details vanished, replaced by a single, nonsensical data point. Bed 14, every nurse on the floor froze in a tableau of shared shock. He was pressing his call button and we were coming in, adjusting his pillows, checking his oxygen, telling him to try and rest. We were treating his symptoms, completely unaware that the potential cure was being held hostage by a fax machine and a case manager with a checklist. I felt a surge of nauseating, white-hot anger, directed at myself, at the hospital, at the entire broken system. I remembered a conversation I'd overheard 2 days ago. A snippet of a heated discussion between our unit manager Sharon and Dr. Evans by the coffee machine. I'd tuned it out, just background noise at the time, the usual friction between medicine and management. But now, the words came back with horrifying, sickening clarity. We can't do the biopsy without the auth code. Sharon, a woman whose primary concern was always the unit's budget, had hissed, her voice a low, sharp weapon. His plan is notorious for denying these claims post-procedure, and the hospital will eat the cost. That's a $30,000 write-off we can't afford. He doesn't have time, Sharon. Evans had shot back, his voice strained with a desperate, pleading frustration that I now understood. His lungs are shredding themselves. You want me to watch him suffocate over a billing code? My hands are tied, Robert. Risk management won't sign off on a non-emergent, non-authorized surgical procedure. Escalate it to the insurance medical director if you have to. Go through the proper channels. The proper channels. The road to hell, paved with prior authorization forms. I could picture the rest. The endless phone calls. The peer-to-peer reviews where one overworked doctor tries to convince another, who is paid by the insurance company to deny claims, to approve a vital test. The demands for more documentation, more labs, more justification. A war of attrition fought with paperwork and phone tag while the patient, the entire reason for the hospital's existence, slowly, agonizingly, died. This wasn't a ghost story. It was a murder mystery, and the killer was a corporate policy. The missing camera footage suddenly made a new, sickening kind of sense. It wasn't a supernatural event. An administrator, maybe Sharon herself, realizing after Mr. Finch's death that the hospital was now open to a massive, indefensible lawsuit for failure to treat, could have easily called a friend in IT. She could have claimed a power surge or a server error near the ICU. She could have had the files for that specific time block wiped. A blinking call light could be explained away as a glitch, an old building's quirks. But a video of an empty hallway, proving no one was physically triggering the alarm, couldn't be so easily dismissed. It was a cover-up, a small, tidy act of erasing a potential liability. They were wiping away the evidence of their lethal inaction. I felt like I was going to be sick. Alistair Finch hadn't died from a mysterious illness. He died from neglect, codified into policy. He had died because his life was worth less than the potential cost of a surgical procedure that his insurance didn't want to pay for. He had spent his last days pressing his call button, begging for an answer, for help, for someone to explain why he was dying, and no one could tell him the truth. We didn't even know it ourselves. I looked up from the monitor, my eyes burning. The ICU was quiet. Chloe was dozing in her chair, her head pillowed on her arms. The rhythmic beeps of the monitors were no longer comforting. They sounded like a countdown. For whom? For Mrs. Gable in bed 8, whose family was fighting with her insurer over the cost of her long-term antibiotic regimen? For Mr. Chen in bed 11, whose experimental cardiac device might not be covered past this fiscal quarter? Maria, her back ramrod straight over a tray of medications, stopped her draw mid-plunger, a 10cc syringe of saline held in suspended animation. Her 25 years in the ICU were etched in the lines around her eyes, and in this moment they deepened into canyons of disbelief. The whole building felt haunted now. Not by the dead, but by the living. Haunted by compromises and calculations, by the brutal bottom-line math of profit and loss applied to human flesh and bone. The ethical conflict wasn't a simple choice between staying silent and speaking up. It felt like a choice between complicity and futility. What could I do? Report it? I'd be facing Sharon, risk management, and a team of hospital lawyers. They'd discredit me in a heartbeat. They'd say I was a disgruntled, overtired night nurse making baseless, hysterical accusations. They'd point to the official chart, which would simply state he died of respiratory failure secondary to atypical pneumonia. They would bury this truth under a mountain of legalese and corporate doublespeak, just as they had buried Mr. Finch. My shift ended. The sun was rising, painting the sky in obscene shades of orange and pink. The day shift came in, bright-eyed and full of caffeinated energy, ready to take over. I gave my report, my voice a flat, robotic monotone. I detailed Mrs. Gable's blood pressure, Mr. Chen's chest tube output. When I got to bed 14, I just said, "Bed 14 is clean and ready for the next admission." I walked out of the hospital into the cool, damp morning air. The world felt wrong, out of balance. People were jogging, walking their dogs, getting coffee, living their lives, completely oblivious to the quiet brutalities committed every day behind the hospital's sterile brick facade. I didn't sleep when I got home. I couldn't. I sat at my small kitchen table, the damning phrases from Mr. Finch's chart echoing in my head. Pending insurance authorization, time-sensitive diagnosis, delay in treatment is associated with extremely poor outcomes. He had been pressing the button. That much was true. Not from the afterlife. He had been pressing it in his final hours, growing weaker, more desperate, as his lungs failed and the air hunger became unbearable. He had probably been pressing it when he had the fatal arrhythmia. His thumb, a final act of desperation, a last unheard plea for help, depressing the switch. And in the silence of his death, the delicate plastic mechanism had simply stuck, the pressure from his lifeless hand holding the circuit open. Then, hours later, when the morgue attendants had moved his body, the button was released. And then something, A vibration from a rolling cart in the hallway, a shift in the building's air pressure as the HVAC kicked on, caused the delicate stuck mechanism to make contact again, and again. It wasn't a ghost calling for help. It was the machine itself, holding a perfect mechanical echo of his final, unheard, ignored call. That was the logical explanation, the one I would have to live with, and it was so much worse than a ghost. A ghost implies a soul, a continuation, a sense of cosmic justice. This was just nothing. A man erased by a spreadsheet, his final plea reduced to a mechanical twitch and a faulty switch. I made a choice. It wasn't a grand, heroic gesture. It was small, and it was terrified. I took a shower, letting the hot water sluice away the grime of the hospital, but not the filth of the knowledge I now carried. I put on a fresh set of scrubs and went back to the hospital that evening, hours before my shift. I went to the Health Information Management Department in the basement, a windowless room that smelled of aging paper. I cited a need to complete my charting from the previous night, a plausible enough excuse. My hands were shaking as I typed my password into the terminal. I printed the pulmonology consult from Dr. Desai. I printed the order for the surgical biopsy with its damning pending status.